Today we're going to get back on this engine. We're going to do piston to valve clearance check. We're going to put in a larger cam, so we want to make sure we got enough piston to valve clearance. We also have shaved off 30 thousandths off the heads, which in essence shortened the heads and brought the valves closer to the top of the pistons. So we need to make sure that that clearance is going to be in play too when we check that. We're going to make two lifters act like they're solid. We're going to only put our rocker arms and nuts on one cylinder, top cylinder number 1. We've already got our cam timed. We're going to rotate the engine as if it were running by hand with a wrench, just through 1 or 2 revolutions. And we're going to check with Play-Doh on top of the piston. Then we're going to take it apart, and we're going to see how much clearance there is between the piston and the valve as they do their jobs in rotation of the engine as it runs. Here's some of what we're going to do, and there's a few things to consider. I'm going to do this check without a head gasket. The reason being is that I don't have a used gasket that I could put on that is already compressed. Plus I have new clean machine surfaces, and I've cleaned these with denatured alcohol. I cleaned the top of the piston with denatured alcohol too. Hopefully my clay or Play-Doh was going to stick to the piston and not go everywhere when I rotate and get lifted off by the valves. I don't want it to get mashed twice. I want to make sure I've got a good clean compression on it when I measure it. However, I do know the gasket I'm using has a compressed thickness of 41 thousandths. So I'm going to add that into my math when I do it, because it's not compressed now, it's a new gasket, and I'm not going to waste a set of gaskets. So most gaskets you could look on the label and it will tell you what the compressed thickness is. So you can figure that into your compression ratio and everything too. I'm going to set this on here real quick, let y'all watch that, and then I'm going to put some bolts in, and then we're going to do our test. These heavy heads, it's easy sometimes to pick them up by the port and put your fingers in the ports on them. Okay, that head is set down flush. I'm going to take my 2 head bolts. I'm going to put them in, and I'm just going to tighten them down so it holds the head in place. I'm not going to torque them, I'm not going to pull them, I'm not going to warp the head with them. I just want them to hold the head in place. That way nothing falls when I go to rotate or do something. Okay, I put 2 of my push rods in. Now, you can think about this however you want to and have your own opinion, but we need to facilitate 2 lifters that are solid, that this part here doesn't compress and go up and down. And because these lifters haven't been pumped up with oil, they're not solid right now. A lot of suggested times people will take the lifter apart and they will put something inside the lifter to make the lifter act solid so that this part will not move. I've done measuring off the edge of the lifter before, and I'm also going to do these off the edges of the lifter. And I'm going to use some household washers, and I'm going to put my push rods in the end of them, and I'm going to do that. Some people like that idea, some people don't. On this engine, because I'm not going below the dog bones and the washer won't bottom out and give me a false reading here, I know that these sit above the dog bones. You can see right there that they do sit above it when they're at bottom travel. I know that I can facilitate this. I also have enough room with my rocker arms and my nuts, because I've shimmed those to get enough threads on here that I'm not going to pull something apart. This is the way I'm going to do it. You can Google this if you want to get really in particular about it, and you can use a different lifter, but then does that different lifter compress a little bit before the washers you put in worked or not? There's lots of different ways to do it. The key factor here to remember is that you have to have this lifter solid in order to do the test, not compressible. Okay. I set 2 rocker arms on, push rods on my washers, and I made sure my washers are centered where I want them to be. Of course, that's my method I'm doing on this engine. Other engines, I'll be more meticulous in this. Now, I put my lock nuts on, and when I tighten these down, I'm going to take up the slack in these push rods right here. I'm going to feel it. Well, there's the slack gone, there's the slack gone. Now, what happens if I tighten this down more than that? Well, if I start to tighten it down more now, I'm going to start pushing the valve open. The spring's going to let me tighten it down. I can take a wrench, and I start cranking this down, and I'll start opening this valve. What I want is 0, valve closed, and I want this right here to rotate freely and turn between my fingers. Take it to right there, just so I take out all the free play, no wiggle. Now we're at 0 lash because we got a solid situation down here, not a hydraulic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to very gently hold this at 0 lash, and then I'm going to tighten this nut, this lock nut. This is the type of lockers I like to use. On a budget motor, you might be doing standard lifters. And if you're doing standard lifters and rocker arms and everything else, you'll have to do it a little differently. I am just going to make that sure that that's locked down right there. I'm going to hold this still, just so nothing moves during my test. I'm not putting a bind on it. I'm not putting any pressure or any preload on it. But I do have a nice, gentle, 0 slack with no rise. That one's off just a little bit. I need to tighten that one down just a hair. I back the nut off. Boy, it doesn't take much. You got to be careful when you're doing this. This is something to be very meticulous about, especially when you set the engine up on the final deal, when you get ready to run it. Okay, ready to run our test. I want to go through a full revolution where this valve opens all the way and closes again, and this valve opens all the way and closes again. That's going to be 2 strokes of a 4-stroke motor, right? Okay. Here we go. We know we're at top dead 0 on piston number 1 right now. We're going to go through and we're going to open these valves. I'm going to rotate through. And there's the exhaust valve opening. We were ready for the exhaust stroke, evidently. Now it's closing. Here comes the intake valve opening. Now it's closing. Okay. Rotate all the way around. I like that. Not quite top dead center so we don't bring up and smash into our Play-Doh again. Now I'm going to take it apart and see what I found. Okay, I lifted my head off. Now remember, we got an extra 41 thousandths to add when we put a gasket in. It'll give us even more clearance. Y'all think those pistons and the valves hit each other? How much clearance do you think we got? Holy cow, we have got lots of clearance. I'm going to pull that off of there and I'm going to lay that out and cross section that with a knife, and we're going to get a really good look at it. You can also see that the piston doesn't quite come up and touch the head surface either, does it? On this engine right here, this piston at top dead center is actually 15 thousandths below this edge. When you have a block rebuilt, sometimes you have it decked where they bring this surface down to where it's perfectly flush with the top of the piston. Okay, here's our cross section. This is our exhaust valve. This is our intake valve. See the closest point where it can make contact there? That's the part where the edge of the valve might come in contact with the eyebrow of the piston. Now from the side view, like we were looking at, you can also see it as well. I'm going to take a pair of calipers. I'm going to measure that, and that's the result we want because that's our closest point of possible contact. That's our first risk. Okay. Exhaust valve. You have to do this very gently so you don't get a false reading. Exhaust valve measures 200 thousandths. We have to have 100 thousandths. We got twice as much as we need, plus the thickness of the gasket. The intake valve right here at the very highest point of contact. Well, I'm even going to make sure I overdo my measurement just a hair. I'm reading 85 thousandths. I'm going to call it 80 thousandths just to be sure. And then you got to factor in sometimes in your mind, you know, expansion of the engine and stretch at high RPM. But that's already figured into what they require, which they ask us to have 100 thousandths clearance. I build engines with less. Some people build them with a lot less, but we usually go to solid lifters to do that, so there's no give or take. Okay, so we've got 80. Plus we've got at least 38 thousandths compressed gasket thickness. So are we over 100? We're over 100. We are very safe on this engine. We've got the valve clearance we want. Does that mean we could put in a higher lift cam? Yes, it does. If we can sit down mathematically and try to guesstimate, and we might say, well, we might get to, and I'll tell you this from memory, 510 lift instead of 498. We could go 510 lift on a cam and still clear in here. We get close. We go more than that and go solid, but there's really no point. When you start building an engine up that one and you want more cam and you get a big enough cam, you need a better piston, and you might as well get ones with great big eyebrow cuts. I'll show you some pistons with a great big cut here in just a second. Now there's a piston with some fly cuts in it, and they're for a bigger diameter valve too, up to a 202 valve. They're bigger and deeper, and if you start looking, there's a little bit of a dome on this piston too. Well, that dome equals out how much area is lost here, so you come up about equal to a flat top piston, which is what we're using here basically. This piston's area measures 6 cc's. We're losing 6 cc's of volume in these cuts, as opposed to having a perfectly flat top piston that had no loss. This here is all equaled out to come close to those numbers too. They give values to them. It's important to check the values when you figure your compression ratio. You've got to be exact on your values of cc's and valve relief and dome, and does the dome fit in the shape of the head, and a whole lot of other factors. But for right now, flat top pistons fit on these heads. We're losing 6 cc's. I figured that in the compression ratio. We're going to do that fun with math here shortly. And we know that we've got piston to valve clearance with the cam that we're going to use, and we are good to proceed forward from there. Oh, we're getting to the rocket science part. So this is a degree wheel. I put this degree wheel on here with 2 washers and got it secured. And I made me a pointer out of some wire that comes down. It's going to point where I can read real careful exactly what it's pointing to. And I might twist it, or I might set it down here and make it point right to a number. It's wherever I want to set it when I get ready. Okay, I've got it on here and it's not set to 0 yet. First thing we need to do is we need to find top dead center. Well, this piston's at the top. Well, okay, people say easy enough. Well, there's top dead center. No, that's not top dead center, because that's a little bit below. There it is at 0, and there could be as much as, look, it just started going down. Well, how many degrees we had there? We have to find the center of those degrees, where it's at the top and it dwells at the top, and how many degrees of dwell it has, or hang time at the top. And we're going to divide that by 2 and go exactly to the center. So what I need to do is make me something to stop this piston before it gets completely to the top. Okay, I got me a piece of aluminum bar stock, just flat aluminum. And I sanded it so it had a nice smooth surface, because I'm going to lay it across this piston on this surface here. Okay. I drilled 2 holes. They're a little bigger than the bolts I want to use. I'm going to use these 2 head bolt holes right here. I'm going to bolt this down flush, but then that piston will come up 15 thousandths shy of touching this and go back down. So I made me a little Allen nut that comes in. I could screw this out just enough. It's kind of it doesn't matter where, enough that when I've got this on here and I screw this up tight, that piston will stop before it gets to the top. Then I'll rotate the engine the other way until it comes up and stops before it gets to the top. And I'm going to mark those degrees on that wheel and take note of those. And then I'm going to divide them by 2, and then I'm going to rotate the engine to that number exactly. Then I'm going to loosen my wheel and turn it and set it to 0. So what we're doing is we're coming up so many degrees before top dead center, going around the other way and coming up so many degrees before top dead center, and then we're subtracting and dividing by 2 to find exactly top dead center, or the exact center of the degrees of dwell time worth at the top, because it comes up and stays while the engine rotates before it starts to go back down. I've got my stopper stopped plenty before it comes to the top, just to give me a nice way to do a mathematical division. This can't be moved at this point now. It needs to sit stable. When I initially set this up, I put this piston at top before I put this stopper on and made it. I put the piston at top of the bore. The gears, the cam gear, the crank gear were at 0, 0 lined up with their dots facing each other, so we knew we were at the proper top dead center approximately. Then I set this wheel up, and I put this wheel on this pointer at approximately top dead center 0. And then I tightened down my washer and put it on. That was just an approximation. Now what I'm doing is I'm coming up shy, and I'm making a note of where it stops one way, and I'm going to put a marker here because there's more than one 30 on this wheel. There's a 30 over here too. Now I'm going to go around the other way and catch a number. Then I'm going to divide those two numbers, come up with my 0, and that's how much I'm going to move this. And I'm going to move this 0 to right here after I find the center of this. Alright, so when they ground this cam, and I'll tell you right now, this is a Ford Motorsports Alphabet E303 cam that I acquired used. It's not a super fancy cam. Some people can mock and make fun of them, but we're going to see if it runs good in this car on our budget build, and I think it's going to do just fine. We didn't have to use modified pistons. We had valve clearance. We were able to use basically a stock engine. We were able to use some stock parts, and it's not so radical that we had to put forth a lot of expense to get what we wanted. What we know right now is that this cam is installed properly. If this number had come off and it wasn't right, you remember all those little notches I had down there on my crank gear? And each one of them had a mark, 2 degrees advanced, 2 degrees retarded, 4 degrees advanced, 4 degrees retarded. I can move this cam in relationship to the crank 2 degrees at a time, which makes the cam move 1 degree at a time because it's a 2-to-1 ratio. I can move that to get what I want and make sure that these numbers come up exact. Just because you got 0, 0, and dot lined up does not mean that the cam and the crank are in the relationship that they are designed to be in. And if you're off, you can have clearance problems, you can have performance problems, you can have mileage problems, you can have all kinds of stuff. Degreeing the cam is important. You don't always have to, and sometimes people say, throw it in and send it. Well, I hate that term. Send it is something that the guys in our military use for a very sacred assignment. That's not what we're doing here. We're not just going to send something down the track to be destroyed. We want it to last a long time. We want it to do right. Here's something I want to mention real quick. When we degree a cam, we also have the option to advance the cam or retard the cam to change the performance of it. This cam is supposed to provide performance from 2,500 to 6,000 RPM. If I wanted to get a little bit more torque on the bottom end, I could advance this cam 2 degrees. If I advance this cam 2 degrees, it's going to bring that power band down. I'm going to lose some top end, but I'm going to gain torque on the bottom. The grunt would come on maybe at 1,800, 1,700. Depends on the sacrifice. However, we're working with a lightweight car. We're going to use an automatic transmission, and surprise, surprise, I've got a 2400 stall converter I'm going to try to work into this mix. So a 2400 stall converter and the power coming on at 2500 with this cam, with the right jetting and carburation, there should be no flat spot fall on its face. It ought to pull up there and slip and that cam come alive and then start pulling the car. Here's a little detail I noticed. These guides to set the heads on sit down a block in a cut. I need to measure that. With my calipers like that and get me a measurement. And I need to come over here and measure the part in the block like this with this gauge, with my calipers. And I need to make sure that this doesn't sit up high enough that it fits down in this hole and keeps the head from compressing the gasket and sealing down, doesn't create a high spot. So I'm going to take these and I'm going to measure them real careful, and I'm going to sand them down. They're a little damaged anyway. And I'm going to make sure they're short enough. they'll still stick up enough. I mean, they'll still stick in here enough. They'll do their job to align the head with the engine block. But I do not want them to interfere with me compressing that gasket down and getting a good seal. Boy, I'll bet you're dizzy. Sometimes I've got the camera going everywhere while I'm trying to hold it and show stuff, and it's jittering and shaking and moving everywhere. But I hope that you caught the detail of what I was trying to show there. I'm going to work on my camera skills, and I think maybe Brian's going to help me do that a little bit too, so I can make everybody not so dizzy when they're trying to watch me show stuff. But these little attention to detail is what I'm talking about. I want to clearance those so that I've got a little bit more clearance, and we don't have an interference problem. I always want that head gasket to go down and be the only thing that contacts, and I don't want those little placement guides to be in the way. I have got one head temporarily put on. I haven't torqued anything down yet, but I rotated my engine so that my head's straight up. It's going to make it a little easier to put this on. I cleaned this surface very well with denatured alcohol. You can use acetone too. And that makes it easier when I put the gasket on to do what it's supposed to do. Now, I'm using a Felpro gasket. And you'll notice there's a spot for these guys to hold it. It also says front right there on each gasket. It doesn't mean that one goes on this way and one goes on the other way backwards. They're made to go on front to front, both sides. And you want to kind of look and make sure that some of these steam holes are open, some of them are closed. On the other side, the other ones are open. The hinges are reversed. This here I'm not going to concern myself with. I think they know exactly what they're doing because this is the one that passes through the head on this side. Okay, and then these water jackets are open. These water jackets are closed. On the other side, it's reversed. Okay, so I'm going to put this gasket on dry. And then I'm going to set the head on. I'm going to set the camera up there and I'm going to show setting the head down. I shortened these and I'm happy with the fact that they're going to clear. I put the head on with no gasket and made sure that there was no gap underneath, that they fit down flush, so I know there's room because we've added a gasket and made it a little bit taller. Okay. We talked about picking the head up by the ports. Boy, are these heads heavy. Something else to be aware of. I don't know if you noticed or not, but before I put all these bolts in these holes, I was dipping them in 30 weight oil, just the threads at the bottom. I've also cleaned all the threads in the engine block because it's very important to clean the threads. Clean them with a thread chaser, a tap, very gently. Don't put it on a drill, do it by hand. A speeder's okay, you can do them with a speeder if you want. But I cleaned all the threads. I washed all the bolts. I cleaned the threads of the bolts on a wire grinder, and I made sure I didn't have any particulates of wire grinder. No wire threads in the engine or anywhere near it or on it. And then I made sure I didn't have any magnetized filings on it. Don't want any of that getting in the engine. So I put the sleeves, little washers, and I lubricated the bolts, the bottoms of them, with 30 weight oil. And here's a fun fact. Did you know that the head bolt torque spec includes 30 weight oil on the threads? That's part of the hydraulic pressure that's required to torque them down properly. I've set my torque wrench. I'm using a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench and a short extension so I can get a nice reach down in here and not be way up trying to waller around. I'm going to torque down the head bolts. Remember, we tightened them hand tight. We let things just sit for a day or two. We don't have to do that. You can do it either way, but I had some other stuff I wanted to do, so I took a break. So we're going to start, and the pattern that I'm going to torque a small block Ford down to is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's the order I'm going to go in to pull this head straight down and not warp it or twist it. That's what's recommended. That's the way it's supposed to be. These Edelbrock bolts, not studs, these Edelbrock bolts are supposed to go down to approximately 80 pounds max. I'm going to go to 80 pounds because they've been used before. that may or may not be recommended. These are not torque to yield bolts. If you have torque to yield bolts, you need to buy a new set. They're not very expensive. But since I'm using these aftermarket Edelbrocks, they're an ARP product. So I'm going to go down to 80 pounds on them, and I'm going to go down in 2 steps. I'm going to start and go down to 50, and then I'm going to wait a little bit, and I'm going to come back and go down to 80. I'm going to do a few of them. I'm going to let you watch how I do one side of them. And I may not go all the way down to 50 to start. I really don't want to over twist anything, so I'm just gonna, not even down to 50 yet. I'm just really snugging things up, and I'm seeing the oil squish out a little bit. Just follow this pattern that we talked about, and remember where you start and where you end up. It's not that bad. We're gonna do the same thing when we do the intake manifold too. Right now I'm just snugging them up, which is actually compressing the gasket. Okay, that one clicked on me. Okay, now we're going to go down to our first step of 50. Remember we talked about having a nice even pull and setting yourself up so that you're comfortable and you pull the same way each time. This is a pretty quiet wrench here, so you're not going to hear it click. I'm going to let them sit for a few minutes. I'm going to come back and go all the way down to 80, and I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to go right on down till they click at 80. Okay, here we go to 80. Okay, I'm going to call that head done. The specs that I'm using are really the Edelbrock specs for these bolts with Edelbrock aluminum heads. These are iron heads. Now the specs are very specific for the Edelbrock aluminum heads, and you want to make sure you follow their procedure. The short bolts down here on the exhaust side, they're calling for one torque spec, and the ones up here they're calling for another. They're doing 70 and 80 on a 5.0 7/16 bolts, which is what we're doing. On 351 bolts, they're calling for a different spec. We're not going to discuss that because we're not doing one of those engines, but you'll have to look them up and follow them specifically. It's the best way to proceed to do that. I went to my stack of parts, and I got me some push rods out that I'd run in another engine. And these are one-piece push rods. They don't have a ball on the end like the stock ones fitted into a tube. You can get push rods with different wall thicknesses, and that's kind of important. You can get them with different ends on them. You can even get some that are big through here and small on the end, so they're extra strong so they don't bend here. But one thing that I do want y'all to remember on this engine that we're building is we're using guide plates. The guide plates we're using because we're using rocker arms that don't keep everything centered. They could move. But the guide plates, when you put this in and you run the guide plate, it keeps things from moving side to side and centered. So you want to get guide plates that have the right slot for the right size push rods you're using. Match them up. Don't use great big slots in the guide plates and let this flop around, or it'll let that rocker arm come off the tip of the valve. So we're going to use those. But when you use guide plates, it is critical that you use a one-piece guide rod that has hardened tube, has a hardened shaft here. Standard ones cannot be used. A lot of people are like, well, can't I just? Well, yeah, you can put them in here and it'll cut a groove in them and then they'll break and you'll scatter everything. So get good guide rods, guide plates and rods to go together in your engine, and do that the right way. That's a corner not to cut. If you're using the stock stuff, stock push rods are fine because they're not rubbing on this guide plate up and down at high speed. The guide plate's not there on a stock setup, and they align themselves with the keys that are in the heads. But I machined all that away to go a little step up on this program today on this one. I went to my stack of parts and got my rocker arms out that I'm going to use, and I blew on them with an air hose to make sure this little oil port was clear, and it wasn't. So I'm going to use me some carb cleaner, and I'm going to put that little red tube in there, and I'm going to blow and make sure it comes out that little port. The oil comes up through the push rod from the lifter under force, and it works its way through here, and it comes up to the little port, and it oils the nut and oils this shaft and everything. And if you don't do that, you're going to have trouble down the road. So I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to go through each one of these meticulously. I'm going to make sure those little ports are cleaned out, because these are used as well. I want to make sure that I got all the oil and crud out of them. This maybe sat over a couple of years while they've been in a bag and maybe caused me a problem there. I want to take a little extra time on that.